You spend your whole life running away from where you came from, buying expensive suits to cover up the smell of diesel and cattle feed, learning to speak in clauses and statutes instead of grunts and handshakes, thinking you've finally scrubbed the country off your skin, but let me tell you something, the dirt always finds a way to pull you back. I was sitting in a corner office in Manhattan that cost more per month than my dad made in a decade, staring at a merger contract that was worth billions, when the phone rang, and it wasn't the ring of a client or a partner, it was that jagged, terrifying buzz of an unknown number from a chaotic area code I hadn't dialed in 5 years. It was Blackwood County General, and the nurse on the other end didn't waste time with pleasantries. She just said, "Mr. Thorne, your father, Elias, he's been brought in, looks like a stroke, maybe stress-induced, but he's non-responsive, and you're the only emergency contact listed in his wallet." I didn't even pack a bag, I just grabbed the keys to the Aston Martin, a car that had absolutely no business being on gravel roads, and I drove west until the skyline turned into flatlands and the flatlands turned into the jagged, unforgiving hills of my youth. I hadn't spoken to Elias in years, not since the day I told him I was selling my share of the herd to pay for law school, and he told me that a man who sells his birthright for a desk job isn't a man at all. Harsh words, sure, but Elias Thorne was a man carved out of granite and bad weather. He didn't do soft. I spent the whole drive rehearsing what I'd say to him, maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, maybe just sitting there in silence like we used to, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened when I turned onto the old county road that led to the ranch. I was expecting the rusted barbed wire, the leaning fence posts, the open expanse of sagebrush that I'd memorized as a kid, but instead, I slammed on the brakes because there, blocking the only access road to my father's 600 acres, was a gate that looked like it belonged to a military compound, not a cattle ranch. It was 12 feet of matte black steel, reinforced with concrete bollards, topped with cameras that swiveled to track my car, and slap bang in the middle was a sign that gleamed with arrogant, fresh paint, Summit Creek Lifestyle Reserve, private property, residents only, and right next to it, a logo of a mountain that looked nothing like the mountains around here, just some corporate clip art nonsense. I sat there for a second, the engine idling, the heat coming off the hood, trying to process if I'd taken a wrong turn, but I knew this dirt, I knew every pothole, this was the road, which meant someone had built a fortress between the public highway and my dying father's front door. 2 guys stepped out of a sleek black SUV parked behind the gate, wearing tactical vests that looked ridiculous on civilians, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, and they walked toward the gate with that swagger of men who've been given a little bit of authority and let it go straight to their heads. I rolled down the window, the cold mountain air hitting me, smelling like pine and impending trouble, and the taller one, a guy with a buzz cut and a jaw that looked like he chewed rocks for fun, leaned in and said, "Can I help you, sir? You're confused, the highway is back that way." I took off my sunglasses, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "I'm not confused, I'm Caleb Thorne, Elias Thorne is my father, this is his land, and I'm going through to check on his house before I head to the hospital, so open the gate." The guy didn't even blink, he just smirked, a little twitch of the lip that told me he knew exactly who I was and he'd been waiting for this, and he said, "Sorry Mr. Thorne, but this area is under the jurisdiction of the Summit Creek Association now. Your father's property has been absorbed into the Preservation District, and since you're not on the guest list, you're trespassing. So turn that fancy car around before we call the sheriff." Absorbed, that was the word that made my blood run cold, not purchased, not sold, absorbed, which in legal terms usually means stolen through some loophole that regular folks don't know how to close. I stepped out of the car, my Italian loafers crunching on the gravel, and I walked right up to the bars, ignoring the guard's hand dropping to his taser, and I said, "Listen to me very carefully, my father is in a coma, I am his power of attorney, and unless you can produce a deed of sale with his signature on it right this second, you are obstructing a resident from their home, which is a felony in this state." The guard laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Look, lawyer boy, we don't carry deeds, we carry orders, and the orders come from Mr. Julian Frost, the director of Summit Creek, and he says nobody in, nobody out, especially not estranged sons looking for a payout, now get lost." I stood there, vibrating with a rage I hadn't felt since I was 18, the kind of red-hot anger that makes you want to throw a punch, but I didn't become one of the most vicious litigators in New York by throwing punches, I did it by finding the loose thread and pulling until the whole sweater unraveled. I got back in the car, threw it into reverse, and as I backed away, I saw them high-fiving, thinking they'd won, thinking they'd scared off the city slicker, but they had no idea they'd just poked a great white shark and invited it to dinner. I didn't go to the hospital, not yet. I needed ammunition, so I drove straight to the county seat, a town that was half boarded up storefronts and half trendy coffee shops for the tourists, and I parked in front of the Hall of Records. I walked in, and the smell hit me instantly, dust, old toner, and bureaucratic apathy, and I went straight to the counter where Mrs. Gable was sitting, a woman who had been running this office since the Reagan administration and who used to give me lollipops when my dad came in to pay property taxes. She squinted at me over her reading glasses, her face softening into a mix of recognition and pity, and she said, "Caleb, oh honey, I heard about Elias, I'm so sorry, is he okay?" I leaned on the counter, keeping my voice low, and said, "I don't know yet, Mrs. Gable, but I just tried to go to the ranch and I was blocked by a gate owned by something called Summit Creek. Tell me you know what's going on." Her face went pale, she looked around the empty office like the walls had ears, and she whispered, "It's a mess, Caleb. This Julian Frost character rolled into town 6 months ago, flashing money, buying up the foreclosure lots, but then he started filing these annexation petitions, claiming that adjacent properties were abandoned or blighted, and under some obscure preservation statute from the 1920s, he's been petitioning to take over management of them." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, and I said, "Management is one thing, ownership is another. Did my father sign anything?" She hesitated, then she turned to her computer, typed for a minute, and printed out a document, sliding it across the counter face down like it was contraband. I flipped it over, and there it was, a notice of voluntary incorporation, dated 3 weeks ago, transferring management rights of the Thorn Ranch to Summit Creek in exchange for debt relief, and at the bottom was my father's signature. I stared at it, my eyes tracing the ink, and I felt the world tilt on its axis because the signature was smooth, flowing, elegant. It was the signature of a man sitting at a desk with a nice pen. My father had severe arthritis in his right hand for the last 5 years. His signature was a jagged, painful scrawl that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. There was no physical way he signed this document, which meant it was a forgery, and a bad one at that. I looked up at Mrs. Gable and said, "Who notarized this?" She pointed to a stamp at the bottom, "Commission of Silas Vane," and I frowned because Silas Vane was the town drunk who used to hang out behind the bowling alley, not a notary public. I said, "Mrs. Gable, this is fraud, clear as day. Why did you file it?" She looked like she was about to cry, and she whispered, "Caleb, the sheriff signed off on the witnessing, Sheriff Boyd, he's tight with Frost, they all are. They said if I didn't file the papers, they'd find a reason to audit my pension. I'm scared, Caleb." I reached across the counter and squeezed her hand, saying, "Don't be scared, Mrs. Gable, you just gave me everything I need to burn them to the ground." I took the document, certified copy, and I walked out of there with a plan forming in my head, a plan that was risky, bordering on reckless, but legally sound if I played it exactly right. I sat in my car and set up my phone on the dashboard mount, turning the camera to face me, and I hit record, staring into the lens with the cold, dead eyes of a man preparing for war. "My name is Caleb Thorne," I said to the camera. "I am the legal representative and son of Elias Thorne. I have just secured evidence from the county recorder proving that the document granting Summit Creek authority over my father's land is a forgery, specifically regarding the signature discrepancy due to my father's documented medical condition. I am now returning to the property to secure my father's medication and critical legal documents which are trapped inside. I am acting under the legal doctrine of necessity, as my father's life is in danger and the blockage is unlawful. Any attempt to stop me will be viewed as criminal containment and kidnapping of property." I stopped the recording, uploaded it to a private cloud server that my paralegal in New York monitors, and then I sent a text to Marcus, an old friend from my days interning at the DOJ who now worked as a private investigator with a very specific set of skills. The text read, code red in Blackwood. "Massive real estate fraud, local law enforcement compromised, forged deeds, hostile takeover. I'm about to do something stupid. Bring the cavalry." Then I put the phone down, took a deep breath, and drove back to the gate. The sun was starting to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-dusted fields, and when I pulled up to the gate this time, the guards were already out of the car, hands on their holsters, looking less amused and more aggressive. The buzz-cut guy walked up, tapping on my window with his baton, and I didn't roll it down this time. I just held up the certified forgery against the glass, let him see it for a split second, and then I pointed to the dashcam that was blinking red. He yelled something, probably a threat, and moved to stand in front of my car, thinking his body was going to stop 2 tons of British engineering, but he underestimated how little I cared about his shins. I shifted the car into sport mode, revved the engine, a low, guttural growl that echoed off the hills, and I saw his eyes widen, realization dawning that I wasn't bluffing. I yelled through the glass, "Move or get moved," and he scrambled to the side just as I floored it. I didn't aim for the center where the heavy lock was, I aimed for the hinge side, the weakest point of any leverage system, and the car surged forward. The collision was loud, a sickening crunch of metal on metal, the airbag sensor flashed but didn't deploy, and the gate groaned, twisted, and then sheared off the bolts, swinging open with a screech that sounded like a dying animal. I didn't stop to exchange insurance information, I roared past them, gravel spraying everywhere, watching in the rearview mirror as they ran for their SUV, radios in hand, calling for backup. I drove up the winding driveway, my heart hammering against my ribs, but when I crested the hill and saw the farmhouse, the anger I felt before seemed like a mild annoyance compared to the icy rage that gripped me now. The front door was wide open, hanging off one hinge, the windows were dark, and there was a white box truck parked near the barn with the Summit Creek logo on it, guys hauling boxes out of my childhood home like they were moving a tenant who didn't pay rent. I skidded to a halt, jumped out of the car, and sprinted toward the porch, shouting, "Drop it. Drop it right now." The movers froze, looking confused, just hired muscle who didn't know the politics, but then a man stepped out of the house, a man wearing a cashmere coat and a scarf that cost more than my dad's truck. He was sleek, silver-haired, with a face that was handsome in a way that made you want to punch it, Julian Frost. He looked at me, looked at my smashed-up car, and tooted, shaking his head, "Mr. Thorne, I presume. You realize you just committed assault with a deadly weapon and destruction of private property? That's going to be a hard case to win, even for a big city lawyer." I walked right up the steps, getting into his personal space, smelling his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of the old wood porch, and I said, "This isn't private property, Julian, it's a crime scene, and you're the perp. I have proof the deed is fake, I have proof the signature is forged, and right now, you're looting a house that doesn't belong to you." Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and said, "Proof? In this county? Caleb, look around you. I own the judge, I own the sheriff, I own the water rights, and I own the dirt you're standing on. That paper you have is just kindling. We're turning this obsolete ranch into a sustainable luxury experience, and your father, well, let's just say he was an unfortunate obstacle who finally got out of the way." I saw red, I lunged at him, grabbing him by that expensive lapel, ready to throw him off the porch, but before I could, I heard sirens wailing up the drive. Not one car, but 3. Sheriff's deputies. They screeched to a halt, dust clouding the air, and Sheriff Boyd, a man shaped like a beer keg with a badge, stepped out with his gun drawn. "Let him go, Caleb." Boyd shouted, hands in the air, "Step away from Mr. Frost." I looked at Boyd, then at Julian's smug grin, and I knew right then that physical force wasn't going to win this. I needed to be smarter. I let go of Julian, shoving him back slightly, and raised my hands. "You're making a mistake, Boyd," I said, my voice calm, deadly calm. "You're arresting the victim." Boyd marched up, spun me around, and slapped the cuffs on tight, way too tight. "You crashed a gate, son. That's all I see. You're under arrest for trespassing and vandalism." They shoved me into the back of the cruiser, the hard plastic seat pressing against my spine, and as we drove away, I watched Julian Frost standing on my father's porch, dusting off his coat, watching his men load my father's life into a truck. It looked like the end. It looked like they had won. But as I sat in that cage, smelling the stale tobacco and sweat of the police car, I wasn't thinking about giving up. I was thinking about the phone call I made to Marcus. I was thinking about the cloud upload. And I was thinking that Julian Frost had made one critical error. He thought he was fighting a grieving son, he didn't realize he was fighting a man who destroyed corporations for a living. The jail cell was cold, smelling of bleach and despair, the kind of place designed to break your spirit before you even saw a judge. They took my phone, my belt, my shoes, and left me sitting on a steel bench for 4 hours without a word. I knew the tactic, isolation breeds anxiety, anxiety breeds confession, but I just sat there, meditating, replaying every interaction, building the timeline in my head. Around midnight, the heavy metal door clanked open, and I expected a deputy with bad coffee, but instead, in walked Julian Frost, accompanied by Sheriff Boyd like a loyal dog. Julian motioned for the sheriff to leave, and Boyd hesitated before retreating, closing the door but leaving the viewing slot open. Julian stood outside the bars, looking at me like I was an animal in a zoo. "Comfortable?" he asked. "I can have them bring you a blanket, Caleb, if you're willing to have a civilized conversation." I didn't stand up. I stayed seated, asserting dominance by not reacting. "I'm fine, Julian. I'm just wondering how you're going to explain the missing safe to the FBI." Julian's eyes twitched. "Just a fraction. The FBI doesn't care about a zoning dispute in the middle of nowhere," he said, smoothing his hair. "Here's the reality, Caleb. Your father is likely not going to wake up. The ranch is drowning in debt, which we bought. You're looking at 5 years for the gate incident. Or, you sign a quitclaim deed tonight, confirming the transfer, and I drop the charges. I'll even pay off the medical bills. You walk away clean, go back to your penthouse, and forget this ugly little place ever existed." He slid a document through the bars. Another transfer form. He even had a pen ready. It was tempting, in a weak moment, it might have been tempting. Just end the war, save my own skin. But then I remembered the way my dad used to look out over the valley at sunrise, drinking his black coffee, telling me that land wasn't about money, it was about holding on to a piece of the earth that knew your name. I stood up slowly, walked to the bars, took the paper, and looked him in the eye. "You know, Julian," I said softly, "you corporate types always make the same mistake. You think everyone has a price. But you forgot to check the background of the man you're trying to extort." I ripped the paper in half. Then in quarters. Then I let the pieces flutter to the floor. "I don't want your money. I want your freedom. I want to see you in an orange jumpsuit that matches this one." Julian's face twisted into a snarl. "You idiot. You have nothing. No phone, no lawyer, no friends within 2,000 miles. Actually," a deep voice boomed from the hallway door, "he's got plenty of friends." Julian spun around. The door to the cell block flew open, but it wasn't a deputy. It was Marcus, wearing a windbreaker that said federal agent in big bold yellow letters, and behind him were 6 other agents, weapons drawn, moving with the precision of a surgical team. Sheriff Boyd was being led in backwards, handcuffed, looking like he was about to vomit. "Step away from the prisoner." Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete. Julian froze, his hands raising slowly. "This is a misunderstanding, I am a businessman." "You're a racketeer, Mr. Frost," Marcus said, stepping into the light. "We've been tracking the Summit Creek shell companies for 2 years across 3 states. Ghost zoning, elder abuse, wire fraud. We just needed a localized event to trigger the jurisdiction warrant. And thanks to Caleb's upload of that forged deed and your little moving crew stealing a safe that contained federal tax documents, you just handed us the keys to the kingdom." I leaned against the bars, a smile finally breaking across my face. "Hey Marcus. Took you long enough." Marcus winked at me. "Traffic was a bitch. Get the keys, let him out." An agent unlocked my cell, and I stepped out, shoeless but feeling 10 feet tall. I walked up to Julian, who was now being cuffed, his face a mask of shock and terror. "I told you," I whispered to him. "You should have done your homework." We drove straight from the jail to the Summit Creek headquarters, which was being raided. Agents were carrying out boxes of files, computers, and servers. In the back office, they found my father's safe. It had been drilled open. Inside were the original deeds, untouched since 1975, and a small velvet box containing my mother's locket, the only thing my dad truly cared about. The next morning, the sun broke over the High Ridge Ranch, illuminating the snow with a blinding gold light. I stood by the broken gate, watching a crew weld it back together, but this time, it was my crew. I had visited the hospital earlier. Elias was awake. Weak, groggy, but awake. When I told him the ranch was safe, he didn't say thank you. He just gripped my hand, his calloused fingers squeezing mine tight, and stared at me with watery eyes. He didn't have to say it. I knew. I walked back to where the Summit Creek sign had been thrown into a ditch. I looked at the twisted metal, the symbol of greed that tried to eat my family's history. It wasn't just about the land, folks. It was about the idea that you can just take things from people because you think they're too small to fight back. Well, they picked the wrong small person. I decided not to go back to New York. Not yet. There's a lot of fences to fix, a lot of trust to rebuild with the old man, and honestly, the air out here, it clears your head. I took over the practice in town, helping other folks who got scammed by Julian's shell companies. We're filing a class action suit that's going to ensure Summit Creek never lays a brick in this state again. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, and I want you guys to tell me what you think in the comments. Julian Frost offered me a way out. He offered to pay the medical bills, clear the debt, and let me walk away rich. A lot of people told me I was crazy for risking prison to save a patch of dirt that doesn't make any money. They say, "Caleb, you could have bought 10 ranches with the payout." But I say some things aren't for sale. What about you? Would you have taken the money and run, or would you have burned it all down just to prove a point? Let me know. I'll be on the porch, reading your answers. But here's the thing about catching a predator like Julian Frost: you think the satisfaction comes when the handcuffs click, when you see that look of absolute shock on a face that's never known a consequence in its life, but the truth is, the arrest is just the adrenaline spike, the real weight, the heavy stuff, that comes in the silence that follows. We were standing in the parking lot of the Summit Creek headquarters, blue and red lights bouncing off the fake stone facade of a building that was designed to look like a community center but was really just a war room for theft, and Marcus, my FBI buddy, looked at me and said, "Caleb, we need you inside, we need you to identify what's yours before we tag it into federal evidence, because once it goes into the system, getting it back is going to be a nightmare of paperwork that even you don't want to deal with." I walked into that office, and it smelled like expensive leather and fear. Agents were everywhere, pulling hard drives, bagging shredded paper, taking photos of whiteboards that had maps of the entire county drawn on them, and that's when the scale of it hit me. This wasn't just about my dad's 600 acres, I saw red circles around the Miller farm, the Henderson place, properties belonging to widows and old-timers who didn't have the money or the energy to fight back. Julian wasn't just running an HOA scam, he was building a kingdom. He was systematically erasing the history of this valley and replacing it with condos and golf courses, and he was doing it by preying on the people who built this country. Marcus led me to a back room, a private office that looked more like a bank vault, and there, sitting on a mahogany desk under the harsh glare of an evidence lamp, was my father's safe, the old steel beast he'd bought at a surplus auction in '82, the one he swore was indestructible, but looking at it now, the lock had been drilled out with a precision that made my stomach turn. I walked over to it, my hands shaking just a little, not from cold, but from rage, because a safe isn't just metal, it's privacy, it's the one place a man like Elias Thorne keeps the things he can't bear to show the world. I reached inside, the metal cold against my skin, and I pulled out the deed, the original parchment from when my grandfather bought the land, crinkled and yellowed, the legal description of the creek and the ridge written in a calligraphy that doesn't exist anymore, and below that, the stack of savings bonds Dad had been buying for me since I was born, the ones he said were for a rainy day. Well, it was pouring now. But at the bottom of the safe, in the back corner, was the thing I was terrified would be gone, a small velvet pouch, worn smooth by years of calloused fingers touching it. I opened it, and the gold of my mother's wedding band caught the light, simple, unpretentious, just like she was, and I felt a lump in my throat the size of a grapefruit because Julian Frost didn't just steal land, he stole the grief of a man who loved his wife more than he loved his own life. I pocketed the ring, looked at Marcus, and said, "Nail him to the wall, Marcus, don't let him plea this down to a white-collar slap on the wrist, I want him to die in a cage." Marcus just nodded, a grim expression on his face, and said, "With what we found on these servers, Caleb, he's going away for a long time, RICO charges, wire fraud, identity theft, we're talking federal prison, not county jail." I drove back to the hospital in a daze, the adrenaline crashing, leaving me exhausted, the kind of tired that goes into your bones. The hospital was quiet, the night shift nurses moving like ghosts in the hallways, and when I walked into the ICU, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, a mechanical lullaby that was keeping my father alive. Elias looked smaller in that bed, the wires and tubes making him look fragile, which was a word I never thought I'd use to describe him, this man who could lift a transmission block and mend a fence in a blizzard. I pulled a plastic chair up to the bedside, the legs screeching against the linoleum, and I sat there for a long time, just watching his chest rise and fall, holding the velvet pouch in my hand. He started to stir around 4 a.m., his eyes fluttering open, cloudy and confused, and he looked around the room, panic starting to set in until his eyes landed on me. He blinked, trying to focus, and rasped out, "Caleb." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bed rail, and said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm here." He tried to sit up but didn't have the strength, so he just slumped back and whispered, "The gate, the men, they said I didn't own it anymore." I shook my head, putting a hand on his arm, feeling the paper-thin skin. "It's handled, Dad. The gate is gone. The men are in jail. The land is yours. It's always been yours." He looked at me, really looked at me, with a clarity that cut through the medication, and said, "I thought you were gone, son. I thought you washed your hands of this place." That hit me harder than any punch. I looked down at the floor, studying the scuff marks, and admitted, "I tried to, Dad. I tried really hard to forget about the mud and the cows and the early mornings. But when I got the call, I drove. I didn't think, I just drove." I pulled the ring out of the pouch and placed it in his hand, curling his fingers around it. "And I brought this back." He held that ring like it was a holy relic, pressing it to his chest, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father cry, not a sob, but a silent stream of tears tracking through the deep lines of his face, the release of a burden he'd been carrying alone for too long. We sat there in silence, the air between us clearing, the old arguments about my career and his stubbornness dissolving because none of that mattered when the wolves were at the door. The next 6 months were a blur of legal battles, but this time, I wasn't fighting for a corporation, I was fighting for my neighbors. I took a leave of absence from the firm in New York, which eventually turned into a resignation, and I set up a temporary office in the dining room of the ranch house. I gathered affidavits from 25 other property owners who had been intimidated by Summit Creek. We built a class action lawsuit that was so airtight it was suffocating. The trial of Julian Frost was the biggest thing to hit Blackwood County since the flood of '96. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, farmers in denim sitting next to FBI agents in suits, and when I cross-examined Julian, he didn't look so smug anymore. I walked him through every forged signature, every illegal easement, every bribe paid to the sheriff, and I watched him crumble, watched the arrogance drain out of him until he was just a small, greedy man in a cheap-looking suit. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a visiting magistrate from the state capital because the locals were all recused, sentenced him to 20 years without parole. But the victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was outside. It was the day we tore down the last of the Summit Creek fencing. A dozen of us, me, Dad, who was walking with a cane now but standing tall, Jack from the feed store, the Miller boys, we all took sledgehammers and trucks and we ripped those black steel posts out of the earth like we were pulling weeds. When the last section of that gate came down, the view opened up, the valley stretching out unbroken, green and gold and free, and I felt something shift inside me, a realignment of my soul. I didn't go back to the city. I couldn't. The skyline of Manhattan felt like a cage compared to the horizon I was looking at. I started a small practice in town, handling estate planning and property law, making sure that what happened to my father never happened to anyone else in this county again. Dad and we're good now. We don't talk much about feelings, we're still thorns after all, but we drink coffee on the porch every morning, watching the sun come up over the ridge, and that's enough. We planted a row of oak trees where the gate used to be. Dad said steel rusts, but oaks just get stronger, and I think he's right. But sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night and I cross that threshold where the guard shack used to stand, I get a chill. I think about how close we came to losing it all. I think about how easy it is for evil to dress up in a suit and call itself progress. And it makes me wonder about justice. We got Julian, sure, but what about the system that let him operate? What about the clerks who looked the other way, the deputies who took the payoffs? They got fired, maybe probation, but they're still out there. It makes you realize that your home, your legacy, it's only as safe as your willingness to fight for it. So I ask you this, and I want you to be honest in the comments below: if you were in my shoes, if you had the high-rise apartment and the $1 million salary, would you have stayed? Would you have given it all up to fight for a piece of land that demands everything and promises nothing but hard work? Or would you have taken the check, let the developer win, and bought your peace of mind somewhere else? Because I made my choice, and I'm standing in the dirt of it right now, but some nights, when the wind howls and the debts pile up, I wonder if I'm the hero of this story, or just another stubborn fool who doesn't know when to quit. Tell me what you think. I'm listening.